the... Excellent. Ooh, that quieted down very quickly. I'm impressed. My name is John Pfeffer. I work here at the Institute for Policy Studies, and I want to welcome you here to IPS here in Washington, D.C. We have a nice full group here in the conference room, and we have a nice full group virtually online. For folks online, we have interpretation in Spanish, interpretación en español. If you choose your channel, you should be able to get that. And if there is a problem, just send a note in chat. We are here to discuss a very urgent and timely question, and that is US-China competition and cooperation, potentially, around critical raw materials, with a special focus on Latin America. We're going to have two panels this afternoon, each about 85 minutes long. We'll take a little break in between. And then the first one really is going to focus on kind of investment and trade questions, the kind of larger economic parameters within which this discussion takes place. And the second will look at some of the consequences of mining and extraction with, again, a focus on Latin America, but bringing in some experiences from around the world. This event is sponsored by Institute for Policy Studies, but also Justice is Global. And a big thanks to Sandy and Valentina for doing a lot of the organizing for this. We have basically two goals for these sessions. The first is to kind of give you the latest information about what's going on the ground and under the ground in terms of extraction, mining, critical raw materials. And, you know, as you know, this topic's been heating up over the last couple of months. Obviously, the United States had some export controls, technology controls on exports to China, but then most recently, China had responded, or in some cases, people call it retaliated, with its own export restrictions, both on what it called dual use, in other words, exports that could be used for civilian and military applications, but also basically a ban on a couple of critical raw materials, antimony, gallium, germanium. Question for us here, are we on the verge of an all-out trade war? Obviously, we're going to have a new president as of Monday, and he has promised all sorts of tariffs and export restrictions. Will that escalate? And what are going to be the consequences for countries throughout the world, especially in the global south, as these two superpowers square off against one another? As I said, we're particularly interested in Latin America, and as many of you are quite well aware, Chinese trade in Latin America has increased quite dramatically. In the 2024, the first 3 months, it increased almost by 10%. That's year on comparison. A lot of what's going to China, raw materials, soybeans, copper, lithium. But of course, the United States is also very interested in many of the raw materials coming from Latin America as well. Our overall concern here is how do we avoid superpower confrontation between the United States and China, and simultaneously, how do we avoid the creation of sacrifice zones throughout the global south, especially in Latin America, our topic of conversation? In other words, regions that have to suffer the consequences of all of this mining and extraction in order so that we have solar panels, et cetera, in the global north. And the second question that we're really concerned about is what can we do about this? Where can we play a valuable and important role as activists and researchers and advocates to avoid conflict between the United States and China and to find ways of promoting sustainable or steady state development throughout the global south? I'm joined by, in these two panels, 6 wonderful presenters. And I should emphasize, joined by a lot of wonderful people in the audience. And we want this to be a conversation between you and Hongqiao, who has joined us online, and a conversation with you in the audience. And we're going to try to keep comments brief in order to encourage those comments. I have a little piece of paper here that reminds people of when it is 5 minutes. It's not really remind you, you probably don't care. But the people up here, 5 minutes and then 10 minutes. And I'll show that to you, and I'll try to be discreet and not interrupt you in any ugly and insulting way. Let me give you the bios very quickly for our first panel, and then I'll give you the bios for the next panel when they're up here. Hongqiao Liu, who is online with us, is an award-winning journalist and independent consultant who has been tracking China's environmental crisis and decarbonization since 2010. If you are lucky enough to receive her newsletter, then you are, well, a lot more knowledgeable about these issues. If you don't get her newsletter, maybe she'll let you know how to get it, because it really is an invaluable contribution. Zhao Zhong is the founder and director of Green Camel Bell, a grassroots environmental NGO in Northwest China. He's done some really remarkable papers about what's going on with Chinese policy. He's been here in the United States for a couple years now, and really looking forward to his insights this afternoon. Krista Shem is a researcher at Climate Rights International, where she conducts research and advocacy on the impacts of the climate crisis on human rights, including a focus on the mining, plastics, and fossil fuel industries. And again, really absolutely important contributions to the consequences of our climate crisis and mining and extraction, especially on human rights. We're going to start with Hongqiao. I'm going to ask a couple of leading questions, and then hopefully we'll go from there. So Hongqiao, the Chinese government is publicly committed to decarbonization and growing the renewable energy sector. It's obviously its own, but also energy sector in other countries. So how has this commitment transformed its policies around critical raw materials in terms of extraction, processing, financing, and control of supply chains? And will there be any changes, do you think, in response to the incoming Trump administration? So I'm going to pass it over to you, Hongqiao.
Hi, thank you, John. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Good. Yes, it's an honor to come back to speak in this distinguished panel and to meet some of my old friends here. Thank you for your question. I think you outlined the background of China's climate commitment in terms of its pledge, domestic pledge, to reach carbon peak. For now, it's still by 2030, but we are expected to see a revised NDC very soon, and the net zero pledge was set for 2060. So yes, China has commitment to decarbonize domestically, and it will rely on renewable energy deployment largely to decarbonize its power sector, which at the moment contributes to the majority of the country's CO2 emissions. And the second part of your question, which is China's commitment overseas about stepping up to help developing countries to reach their climate goals, which is also true. Again, at the same time, I think I would like to remind everyone here that these commitments were made. The first one, the dual carbon goal, was made in, I think, late 2020. So it's been almost 4 years, and it provides a good amount of time to look into China's progress in terms of delivering the domestic dual carbon goal. And in terms of the stepping up on helping developing countries to ramp up the deployment of renewables, the commitment was made 2-3 years ago, and there are some evidence showing that China has been delivering more and more projects. We are also seeing greening the BRI and focusing on the small and the beautiful projects, namely smaller scale wind turbine, solar panel projects, battery factories, etc., etc. So we are sitting at a crossroad, to be honest. As I mentioned, it's time to review China's promise in the past few years and preparing for the upcoming new five-year plan. So a lot of things may happen, and there are a lot of policy discussions. And when it comes to critical raw materials, of course, it's at the center of the debate domestically and internationally. In the past 10 years, when I was still a journalist back in China and a researcher there, I covered rare earth pollution in depth. So over the period of 10 years, we've seen China has been putting more and more efforts to clean up domestic supply chain of critical raw materials and climbing up, in its own words, in the value chain. But we've seen some of the outcomes of the Made in China 2025 campaign made back then. So there are some progress, but also concerns, of course. I think people in the audience are more informed about the concerns of China's critical raw material policies and its impact outside of China. In terms of financing, I think this is something that I'm really interested in following and looking into the initiatives from domestic market players and also government initiatives. Green finance, climate finance has been mentioned repeatedly as a vehicle to finance such projects, because the obvious direct linkage between critical raw material extraction, processing, and moving up to the value chain with China's own clean energy transition, and as you mentioned, outside as well. So I guess I think people, I think as the activist community or policy campaigner community should really look into the safeguards on the environment, on people, and on communities, right? The biodiversity, etc. I myself has been recently looking into some of critical mineral projects outside of China, namely mostly in Southeast Asia. And I unfortunately haven't done any particular country-specific research in Latin America, which, as I heard, is one of the regional focus of this panel discussion. In terms of nickel mining and processing, Chinese companies obviously has, as many of you have already know, been a leading dominant monopoly. It depends on how you call it, in nickel processing and the entire value chain. And we're also seeing Chinese companies as well, partially in response to Chinese policy pressures, but also in response to international investors' pressures, as well as in response to geopolitical tensions. They are taking more actions these days. I guess the question again is really to watch devils are always in the detail. Are they just publishing ESG reports, publishing, making commitments and the pledge without actually delivering it, or, to what kind of concrete change can be made from there? And one of the, I guess, again, I'll try to keep my intervention short. I think one of the arguments that I've been hearing again and again in the clean energy community is that Chinese nickel development companies can actually use industry park as, by borrowing the Chinese zero carbon industry park model and borrow that and bring that into Southeast Asian countries, for example, to power the energy intensive nickel processing projects, to show local country, to show the host country, Indonesia, and the communities that clean energy is doable, it's feasible, and it can serve not just cleaning up the value chain or supply chain of the critical raw material itself, but also showing local people that clean energy can be used to unlock the country's clean energy it's quite late here. I'm trying to I will try to speak slowly a little bit to unlock the country's clean energy potentials, to really to introduce kind of like industry park as a model, to start with something small, attract private investment, having a good interaction, and really to address all the intersections between critical raw materials, wind turbines, batteries, all the products. But again, as I mentioned, that was in the details how the companies are committed and how they communicate that with local communities, with local government. And of course, we are also seeing Chinese companies playing in some part of the world. And again, in my case, in the case that I look into, in some local, we tend to look at the national Chinese companies, critical raw material companies' impact to national politics or geopolitics at national level. But actually, sometimes the influence are also seen more visibly at the local level. To your second question, whether there be any changes in response to the incoming Trump administration, I think there will be, for sure. I don't have any, I wouldn't say I'm confident to say what change will be there at this point. So I guess I would just, say a few things. I think the general trend is that, let's not forget Chinese economies. It's still rebounding back in the past few years. The economy is struggling. So critical raw materials is something that can potentially still bring, generate so-called green GDPs inside China. And as many of you are already aware, critical raw materials are also at the front line of this trade war disputes. Since I think the last time would be 2017 or 2019 when Trump first took office and started this trade war on rare earth minerals. And I would expect such tensions continue. Whether they will continue to escalate will depending on both countries' response. And of course, I believe there are a lot of space for advocates in the audience and in the panel to play a role in. Thank you.
Thank you, Hongqiao. Not only thank you for the content, but you were admirable in terms of holding to within 10 minutes. And you have set an excellent example for all of us in our life, not just here on this panel. We're going to follow up on that, especially some of your points on Indonesia, because I think Krista's going to talk also about Indonesia a little bit. So thank you for introducing that. I want to turn to Zhao Zhang and ask you a question as well. And my question for you, it's not a surprise because I already sent it to you, but China's Belt and Road Initiative is a huge project involving 150 countries and over $1 trillion in investment. It's huge, but it's also evolving, it's changing. Can you tell us about some of these changes, particularly around the extraction of critical raw materials, and where have these policies come into conflict with the strategies of other countries and institutions?
Okay, thank you for the question, and also have some preparations after you sent me the questions and write down some data and number. Is that okay? Hello? Okay, yeah. So I will address it from three perspectives: fact, policy, and discourse. Starting with the fact, as the data of 2024 still has not yet been released, so I will refer to the statistic from 2023 and earlier. And in 10 years after the launch of a Belt and Road Initiative, it culminated global engagement surpassed $1 trillion. In 2023, Africa emerged as the largest recipient in BRI investment and seeing a 114% increase and to $21.7 billion. Latin Americans experienced 92% increase, reached $5.5 billion, or 20.5% of total Chinese BRI investment that year. And Southeast Asia and saw a 27% increase at the same time period. So these regions, Africa, Latin American, and Southeast Asia, are key areas of China's BRI mining investment. And Indonesia received the largest single share of investment in 2023, approximately 7.3 billion US dollar. And why Bolivia, a country in South America, and recorded remarkable 493% increase in BRI engagement, and because China. Indonesia is a critical important for Chinese investment in copper and nickel investment, and Bolivia is part of the lithium triangle, also the central for the lithium extraction project for Chinese BRI investment. And overall, the BRI engagement in mining and metal reached to 19.4 billion US dollars in 2023, with an increase of 158%, and that remarks the highest level since 2013. And so this investment closely tied to the global green energy transitions, and particularly for the critical mineral like lithium. And so China is now dominate the mining and the processing on a global scale, and controlling over 80% of global graphite resources, and more than 50% of the processing capacity of lithium, graphite, cobalt, and what else? Okay, and nickel, yeah. And so by this year, 2025, China is expected to secure access to 1/3 of the world's lithium production capacity. So here's just some facts about China's Belt Road initiative and investment on mining. And so now I will move to the policy changes. And so the most significant shift about BRI policy is the introduction of green BRI. And because when the BRI was launched in 2013, most of the investment focused on infrastructure and energy projects, and including coal projects, which draw widespread criticism and for environmental harm. And some concern and range from the greenhouse gas emissions, the threat to biodiversity, the water and land loss depredation, and the indigenous right violation, as well as the hazardous waste. And so in response to those criticism and also increasing international pressure, Chinese government issued the guiding opinion on promoting green and belt and road construction in the year 2017, and issued by 4 ministries, including National Development and Reform Commission and the Ministry of Environment. And these policies highlight the integration of ecological and environmental protections into all stages of BRI project, aiming to help BRI countries to achieve the 2030 SDG Sustainable Development Goals. And in 2021, the Ministry of Ecological and Environment and the Ministry of Commerce released guidelines of green development of overseas investment and cooperation, and encourage Chinese companies to adhere to international green standard and adopt those global recognized practice. So that's going beyond the host country regulations and requirements, because we criticize many of those multinational companies about their double standard. Maybe in their home countries, they have a good environment performance, but when they go the business to investment in some developing countries, they said, okay, we just comply with local regulations. But so this singular is still good things and to show that China wants to go beyond the host country's requirement. And also, we can see the further advancement come in 2022, and with the issuance of guidelines on ecological and environmental protection of overseas investment and cooperation construction project. In the context of the China's dual carbon target, Hongqiao just mentioned, and also the China's pledge on stop build overseas coal power plant, and as well as host the UN Convention on Biological Diversity COP15. And so we can see these guidelines issued on 2022 and specifically required the Chinese investor, Chinese program to pay attention about the climate change mitigation, as well as biodiversity protections, offering some tailored instructions to different project phases and different industries. And supporting those efforts, the China's MEE, Ministry of Ecological and Environment, established the Belt and Road International Green Development Coalitions, which is a government organized NGO, to foster the Green BRI discussion and report. And China's Chamber of Commerce of metals, mineral, and chemical importers and exporters, it's called CCCMC, also launched the grievance mechanism and to address the complaint to Chinese overseas mining project. And also they launched an initiative called Responsible Critical Mineral Initiative with the cooperation with some international organizations, including wildlife conservation societies. And so despite these efforts, critics argue that and the Green BRI is just a top-down initiative, and it's primarily used by Chinese companies and to justify their greenwashing practice, and also doubt about its authenticity, and also doubt about the validity of the Green BRI. So that's one shift about the policy. Another notable policy shift related to China's strategic mineral catalog. And under China's National Mineral Resource Plan and 2008 to 2015, and only uranium, copper, and nickel and other mineral were classified as an important mineral. And however, and the 2016 update expand the strategic mineral list to include lithium, the cobalt, and graphite. So that reflects the rising demand from China's burgeoning EV, electrical vehicle, and renewable sectors. Okay, yeah. And similarly, the US Geological Survey added nickel as to its 2022 list of strategic mineral. And so that's showing US growing emphasis on the development of renewable energy. And so now I will move to the discourse. Yeah, and part of when ongoing research, I analyzed the 300 pieces of contact and from China, spanning the government policy paper, the media report, the academic articles as well as the social media posts, and from between 2013 to 2024. So we observed a notable shift in narratives about China's investment in mining sectors. And before 2017, the focal areas was economical complementarities, highlighting the cooperation between China and the BRI countries and benefit for both sides, and through supply-demand alignment, the technical improvement and personal training to foster industrializations. And the discussion on mining and is often embedded in a broad narrative of bilateral cooperation. And after 2017, the narrative shifts to emphasize on civilization, ecological civilization principles, and because that's proposed by Chinese president, and also to portray Chinese companies prioritizing environmental protection and the contribution to modernization efforts. And the themes of green development and supply chain upgrade I become more and more prominent. And my research colleagues, he's from South American, and he analyzed the 468 materials in English and Spanish from BRI countries. So narrative from those BRI countries emphasize on national perspective, sovereign development, supply chain value addition, and regional competition. And for example, in Argentina, China narrative frame BRI investment as a solution to the country's economical crisis, and also emphasize green technology and financing. And Argentina narratives position China as a partner and benefactor, and adding economical recovery, and while maintaining resources sovereignty. And Argentina mining minister said in 2022 that the Argentina aimed to transitioning from the extractive model and that dominated by the US to a more autonomous role in the global economy. So that's also a proof of the US-China competition in global south about the mining and issues. And however, some negative reports, such as mining workers in a Chinese lithium mine in North Argentina, which are highlighted by BBC and Western media, and it has remained because it's related to the workers' protests against the Chinese investment. So this information remains largely absent from Chinese and Argentina alternate. So in conclusion, and our studies highlight how China's media and Chinese diplomatic channels tailor their rhetoric to align with host countries' priorities, emphasize national pride, supply chain upgrade, poverty alleviation, and green development. And however, those narratives often lack meaningful engagement with the grassroots movement and indigenous rights. So that's reflecting a top-down approach, prioritize the extraction, resource extraction over inclusive development. So that's my share. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move on to our third presentation. Our translator sent me a little note, and they said, could you ask the panelists to speak more slowly? But that was before you began. And I think actually she was just talking about me, because I was talking too quickly. So I'm taking that as a personal, but I'm passing it on just, because, but if you could speak less fast than me,
Fabulous.
that would be great.
Incredible.
So Krista, please.
Perfect. Will you read the questions?
Oh, you're right.
So I don't just go in your spiel.
I'm going to read this question, and I'm going to read it slowly. Krista. Indonesia has been an investment focus of both China bilaterally and Western governments multilaterally through the JET-P programs, particularly around nickel production. We've already heard a good deal about nickel from our previous presenters. What have been the chief lessons from the great power competition in Indonesia? And have there been any useful cooperation in terms of standard setting?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And yeah, really honored to go after both of you for being such wonderful speakers. But really just to like break down the nickel thing just a bit more. So last year, Indonesia provided about 55% of the world's nickel. By the end of this decade, that number is supposed to jump up to 65%. So nickel is obviously a key mineral for a lot of renewable energies. The average electric vehicle has 39 kilograms of nickel in its battery. So we're talking about a lot of nickel. And so it's, a key mineral, and Indonesia really is dominating the global supply. In 2020, the Indonesian government banned the export of raw nickel ore. And so what that means is not only is nickel mined in Indonesia, it is also processed in Indonesia. This kind of concept is called downstreaming of the EV industry. So the idea that Indonesia is going to be the global dominant power in terms of mining of minerals, processing them, creating batteries, and then ultimately building electric vehicles. This has been one of the chief central economic policies for former President Joko Widodo, and is being continued by the new president, Prabowo Subianto, who was just inaugurated in October. So this piece around nickel is not going to go away in Indonesia. Chinese companies generally have been really dominant in terms of investing in Indonesia's nickel industry, particularly on the processing side. In terms of mining, you have a lot of Indonesian companies that are really dominating the mining of nickel, but processing is largely run by large Chinese companies. Because of this export ban, there's been this massive build out in large industrial parks, in pretty remote parts of the country. So last January, my organization, Climate Rights International, we released a 125-page report documenting human rights, environmental, climate abuses at one of these large industrial parks, the Indonesia Weda Bay Industrial Park. I interviewed around 4 dozen people who were living near the industrial park who told me how their land had been taken by companies, their rights had not been respected, that they were intimidated by police and military personnel working on behalf of companies to sell their lands, that their health was at risk because of pollution from captive coal-fired power plants that were recently built to power the industrial activities, as well as really significant threats to their access to clean drinking water and other really basic human rights. I encourage you all to take a look at the report. There's also a shorter, 9-minute documentary that's, a little shorter than a 125-page report. But really, these abuses, are not local to this one place, but are really indicative of the nickel industry in Indonesia. The way that Indonesia's key role in this has kind of come in between, the role of, Chinese companies and the Chinese government and the United States. And so, as you alluded to, Indonesia is an absolutely important trading partner and provider of minerals and processed minerals to, both economies. Like I said, Prabowo was just inaugurated in October, and in the first month of his presidency, he made high-level trips to both China and to the US to meet with both heads of state. When Prabowo and President Xi Jinping met, they had a slew of MOUs. They signed multiple MOUs specific to critical minerals around cooperation, and included $10 billion in business contracts came out of that meeting between Chinese companies and Indonesian companies around minerals, green energy, agriculture. Immediately from leaving Beijing, Prabowo flew to DC where he met with President Biden. For over the last year, the Indonesian government has been working with the US government to negotiate a limited free trade agreement, which many people in this room here have been working on quite a bit as well. The key purpose of that is under the Inflation Reduction Act, there are provisions that in order for companies to qualify for tax credits for electric vehicles, there has to be either a limited free trade agreement with the US or those minerals have to be sourced from within the US. So the Indonesian government has really been courting a free trade agreement in order to, gain those tax provisions. It's been a pretty slow road, as I'm sure none of you have heard of a free trade agreement because it has not happened yet. The end of last year, a group of bipartisan senators in the United States wrote an open letter saying that they did not want a free trade agreement with Indonesia, in part because of the human rights, the labor rights violations, but also in part of the role of Chinese companies in Indonesia's nickel industry. That being said, it's still something that both countries seemingly are working on. There are a lot of high-level media articles about it. That being said, really unclear whether that will move forward within a Trump administration. Obviously, he has critiqued the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's particularly the piece around the electric vehicle tax credit. That being said, the Indonesian government and the U.S. government, made many claims about their commitment to each other, including on things like raw materials. So that's a little bit about the state of maybe cooperation, the role of Indonesia in the middle of these two. That being said, there are places where there is, cooperation between, both Chinese and U.S. companies specifically. So one of the roles is, directly between company to company that we're seeing cooperation. So there are U.S. automakers that have, offtake agreements with Chinese companies that are sourcing minerals from Indonesia. So for example, in Tesla's annual investment impact report that they publish, it's a public document on their website, it lists direct Chinese companies that are mining and processing nickel in Indonesia that they have direct trade relationships with. There right now only one U.S. electric vehicle company that has direct investments in Indonesia. That's Ford, and Ford has a direct or a joint venture, including with some Chinese companies, with Hongqiao Cobalt and also with Vale. So there is cooperation of companies, sourced and headquartered in the United States with Chinese companies. At the end of the day, electric vehicles and the chemistry of current EV batteries generally include nickel, and so that's a mineral that they'll need to continue having. The other place is, around some of these investments. So, there's been, as you mentioned, a lot of bilateral investments. I just talked about the 10 billion, the large piece around Chinese companies directly investing in Chinese or in the nickel industry. The U.S. general investments have been a little less direct. So the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, is a $20 billion effort. It's spearheaded by the U.S. and Japanese governments and includes other members of the G7, including many EU member states. The goal is to raise $20 billion to help Indonesia's energy transition. So by far, Indonesia is generally powered using coal. Most of that coal is mined in Indonesia. It's also the world's largest exporter of coal. And so part of this idea of providing funds to support this energy transition is decarbonizing, the national energy grid, as well as, providing investments in things like, infrastructure for new renewables. Notably the JETP and also a recent commitment by Prabowo to decarbonize from coal by 2040. Both of those do not include captive coal plants. So maybe this is something that we can talk about as a panel also, but Indonesia has a significant amount of brand new captive coal plants that are being built today to power the nickel industry. Right now, there's around 24 gigawatts of captive coal plants either in operation or under development. So that's more coal than that's burned in Australia. It is a massive amount of coal, and these are brand new coal plants that are only being built to process nickel. And so, when we're looking at the roles of whether it's Chinese companies or other foreign companies that are coming and building these coal plants, understanding the role of why are, these specific types of coal plants being treated differently than, the commitments to stop funding overseas coal plants. So yeah, maybe I'll pause there and happy to kind of continue the conversation with you all.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we have a lot of material on the table. We actually have two questions virtually, but before I ask those questions, I want to get some comments or questions from the audience. We have three questions, and we can wrap them together as we address you. And you'll have a chance also to address maybe what other of your presenters have said, because there's a lot of overlap, especially on this question of Indonesia and the role of dirty sources like coal powering nickel processing, for instance. But first, any thoughts, questions? And I have to remind you that they actually won't hear you if you ask a question, so I have to repeat them, which means that the shorter your question is, the easier it is for me to repeat it in a timely fashion. But you could also comment as well, but it will be a short comment. Yes, Becky.
I would like to very briefly ask for more information about Hongqiao's cat.
About what?
Hongqiao's cat.
Oh, Hongqiao's cat. Okay, that's a question just for Hongqiao, unless you guys want to talk about that. You might have something to say about her cat. Hongqiao, I'm sure will be interested in responding to that. Other questions, comments? Yes?
Is there any evidence of political intervention by either the Chinese or the U.S. governments in politics of countries where they're contesting the minerals, particularly Indonesia and Bolivia and other countries?
Interesting. Okay, so that question, okay, the first question was about Hongqiao's cat. Now, Hongqiao, you can prepare a response to that. The second question was, is there any evidence of political interference in countries like Indonesia or Bolivia that are critical raw material producers, presumably to influence the capture or the acquisition of those critical raw materials? I am gonna, yes.
What is expected to happen to the free trade agreement that's obviously the one in Indonesia doesn't exist, but the one in Japan? Like, do we have any idea what's going to happen to those since they were negotiated exclusively through the executive branch?
What's going to happen to them under a Trump presidency? Yeah. So the question is, what's going to happen to already negotiated free trade agreements, not the one with Indonesia, because that hasn't been finalized, but for instance, with Japan under a Trump administration. Okay, we have a lot of good questions. I'm just going to throw into the mix, there are 3 now from online, 4 now, oh, too many. But I'm going to throw those in and you can answer any and all of them. But I might ask specific people for responses. So there's a question about debt, about the debt trap that countries find themselves in. They've taken money, in this question is taking money from the Chinese government, and find themselves beholden to the Chinese government, but also the possibility of corruption involved in the financing that has produced that debt, and whether there are possibilities of officials in especially poor countries taking bribes and thus making very poor decisions on behalf of their country economically, because they've made a decision for their own personal, wealth rather than national security. Are there any no-go zones? Has the United States or Chinese government said, hey, there are parts of the world that we should not be extracting minerals from, like the Amazon, for instance? So has there been any discussion of no-go zones? I'm going to throw in this last one, and then Nick, you'll wait for the next round. Is there any possibility with this free trade agreement with Indonesia, the US and Indonesia free trade agreement, to introduce stronger labor and environmental standards? So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to start with Hongqiao. And if you, Hongqiao, could talk a little bit about whether there are any no-go zones that have been established. And then I'm going to ask you about debt trap, because it was specifically for you. And then the 2 questions about free trade agreements. And there was one more in there that I've forgotten about, but which I'll remember while you're answering those questions. Hongqiao, could you go first, please?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's a very interesting question to start with. I'm not aware of such a no-go zone from the Chinese policy makers, at least. But I see where you come from. And I think we all know there are biodiversity hotspots all around the world, inside China as well. We've seen China has been making a great effort to show is to step up on not just climate leadership, but also biodiversity conservation leadership, and committing biodiversity finance, et cetera, leading the Kunming COP16. We don't have this like no-go zone per se, but there is this agreement about protecting 30% of the land and ocean on the planet from the Kunming Montreal Agreement. So there are some. I think it gives us a direction to work towards. Right. as I said, I see where you come from. Inside China, there are national park systems, there are protection zones, there are policies that have been existing for a really long time. Certain core protection zones are prohibited from any kind of mining, including critical raw materials. However, in the past decades or two, there are violations to such policies domestically. So I think having the no-go zone, a list of no-go zone, is a good start. But we also have to look into the implementation. And again, civil societies, oversight, watchdogs from the news media, they will all play a very important role to make that happen. And I will pass it to the other speakers.
Excellent. I remember what the other question was, and I'm going to circle back to at the end, Hongqiao, with that one. But let's go to the question of debt first. And actually, there was another question that someone wanted to know how much BRI investments are going in specifically into nickel production processing in Indonesia. So either one of you could perhaps answer that one. But the debt question.
Okay,
first.
yeah, about the debt trap, I think because through our research about the discourse in BRI countries, we figure out those countries is authoritarian countries. We are probably have a high commerce about the BRI. So that's also the difference between people's opinion and also the political leaders' opinion about the program. And for I think most of the democratic countries, the people's voice can similar to leaders' opinion, but for the authoritarian countries, it might have a big gap. So that's also the issues about the debt. For example, if we talk about the airport in Nepal, talk about the high-speed train from Jakarta to Bachchan, and the government really want to have this program, and maybe for the good country image, maybe for corruption issues, but maybe many local people, local residents, they don't have a high commerce to this program because the price for the high-speed train is so high they cannot afford that. And also that's for the debit issue is because we do find the gap between the community's voice and the political leaders' voice. So that's also something that we can discuss later today or tomorrow, how we can fill in the gap and how we can make sure the community members and especially those vulnerable groups, people, their voice can be heard by Chinese investors and as well as the policy makers. But currently their visibility is not so high, and if we check the website, internet in Chinese media, so we couldn't find a lot of information about those community voice. So that's also maybe for many Chinese citizens, they think the BRI is a good project because the only information inside China is more like the government controlled media and many propaganda information. But if you can have a more different kind of information, if you can, and to deal with the language barriers, fireworks, the online fireworks, maybe you can find the real authentic information so that people can make the right judgment about the debt issues, whether they really want the Chinese investment, they want to have this program.
Excellent, thank you. Free trade agreements.
Sure. I think going to the first question on the Japan critical minerals trade agreement, I mean, it's so unclear, what will happen, say, like next week, that without, being incredibly speculative. But for example, if those tax provisions no longer existed, then that would likely have a legal implication on that and how that trade agreement stands. Obviously, there's a lot of brainstorming we could probably all do together around the role of tariffs and how that might interplay. But critically, to the second question about how these trade agreements could be leveraged, and it's absolutely possible for them to include really strong and stringent safeguards for human rights, for labor rights, and for the environment. there's a group of civil society organizations that, did a co-submission to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office in 2024, setting out some of those standards around the fact that not only should there be laws on the books in countries that are looking to sign a trade agreement with the United States, but actually that those need to be upheld. That it's not just having strong laws on paper, but actually implementing those things, protecting the rights of workers and frontline communities. And I think just a little bit separate from both this like U.S.-China context is the fact that there are other legal mechanisms that could be used to address some of these harms. So particularly in the EU and in multiple EU member states have corporate supply chain due diligence laws, so the CSDDD in the EU, as well as the French vigilance law and the German supply chain due diligence act, that put companies that are doing large amounts of business in Germany, in the EU, legally accountable for human rights abuses in their entire supply chain. So that means if a large company is sourcing nickel from Indonesia, that it is responsible for ensuring that it's purchasing those materials, even if it's not in its direct operations or not contributing to abuses. And so that's something that either country or other countries as well could look at as well.
Excellent. Do we have a ballpark figure, a general figure for how much BRI funding is going into Indonesia for nickel?
Actually, I currently don't have this information, but I think some other think tank and research institutions, they do some research.
I've seen it. It's in the tens of billions.
Okay, lots of money, a lot. Circling around to Hongqiao, there was a question about domestic interference in countries, political interference in, say, elections or election campaigns in countries that have significant critical raw materials by countries like the United States or China in order to secure access to those raw materials, let's say lithium or nickel. Hongqiao, do you have any examples of that kind of political interference you can cite?
Personally, I don't have any case at hand, I think. But what you described sounds very familiar. It's one of the main things, let's say, or themes surrounding regarding China's BRI investment in the past decade. We've heard a lot of talk and chat, some papers coming out regarding China's interference. I don't have the evidence at hand. I don't personally look into these issues. But what I see from the question, I mean, what is actually behind the concern behind your question, I think, is whether in the future, as both countries, as not just China, US, but also other countries competing to implement their clean energy transition plans and desperately needing critical raw materials to support that transition, would the critical raw materials become the next, let's say, oil and gas or other, I don't know. Before we've seen coal or oil countries starting war with that for fighting for resources like that, where critical minerals be the next commodities that might trigger security challenges at a regional level or sub-regional level. I think for me, I would actually ask further. Unfortunately, again, as I said, I don't have the evidence to answer or address to say yes or no. I think my underlying concern, as I briefly mentioned, would also be if we cannot address. Okay, there are several layers of the questions I see here. What Zhao Zhong was explaining is, sorry, not just Zhong, but also a few others were asking, and I also see this in the comment about good governance, right? Good natural resource governance. We are desperate for a good or a few good models on critical mineral extraction, processing, etc. Unfortunately, there's no perfect model at the moment. And in the lacking when such models are missing, and the concern would be, would that be escalated to, one example would be domestic interference. The wider question for me would be international security challenges. And when we talk about climate refugees, all the other social economic impacts of climate change, I would actually challenge us to think a little bit further. The competition for critical minerals, or for other resources that are required for the transition. Are we shooting ourselves in our foot as we transit? I don't have the answer. These are very philosophical questions to ask. I hope to see more analytical work on that and more evidence at least, to address that question as well.
Excellent, thank you. There are a couple of comments online. I will go to those, but first I want to go to the audience. Yes.
I'm curious about critical minerals mining in the oceans. Could people comment on like what the percentage is currently, where that's projected to go, and also if most of that is happening in like water that's clearly territorially defined, or if there's a lot of conflict there?
Okay, the question is about mining of critical raw materials in the ocean. The conversation so far wasn't depressing enough, so Arthur wanted to make it more depressing. Other comments, questions? Yes, Maurice.
Wondering what's the status of the European Union suit against Indonesia at the WTO, and what that says about North, Global South dynamics as it relates to the control of access to.
Excellent. Question was about EU suit against Indonesia. This is when Indonesia banned raw nickel exports in order to encourage processing at home, which then, of course, was supported in large part by Chinese, but not exclusively Chinese investment. So what is the status of that suit at the World Trade Organization?
Well, John, when you introduced the panel, you mentioned the steady state economy. And I was just wondering if any of the organizations here about, address the likelihood of a U.S.-China conflict as long as the overriding policy goal is GDP growth for both of those two countries as well. So, or is it just like a bridge too far? Is it a challenge?
Question is about growth being at the heart, essentially, economic growth at the heart of, well, a lot of things, but certainly critical raw material use, extraction, processing, and application. United States and China talking about this question of growth in any critical way, I guess, other than simply supporting it. Yeah, Sandy.
I have a question about the Indonesia sort of as a model. In many different circles, I've heard people saying they're going to replicate Indonesian experience. I just wonder, has any country attempted that, and how is your experience? And also in those circles, some of the representatives or interest groups in those countries actively saying that their strategy should be playing these two great powers up against each other. So I assume that that's what's probably is already happening in Indonesia itself. So how's that going? Is there any valuable lesson that we can learn from that?
Question is about whether there are other examples other than Indonesia of countries that have kind of leveraged their critical raw materials in the way that Indonesia has, a kind of state-led industrial policy. Are there any lessons that we can learn there? And what about the China-US superpower competition? And has Indonesia in some sense leveraged that to its benefit as well? Which brings me to one of the comments that was on online from Jojo Nem Singh. He says, I think we need to be careful how we frame our critique of the Indonesian policy. To date, there has not been a successful model of resource-led growth except the Indonesian case. And so he says it's unrealistic to expect mining countries to do everything at the same time, higher standards as well as taking advantage of their mining exports simultaneously. So there's a lot there. I am going to go the opposite way. We're going to start with you, Krista. Perfect. I'm not even going to ask you a specific one because you should answer the question you want to answer.
Sure. Yeah, of course. I think a big key piece, and maybe going to one of the questions around Indonesia as a case study. It's something that people ask me a lot about, and as well as my partner organizations in Indonesia and local communities. North Maluku, the province of the Indonesia Weda Bay Industrial Park that I mentioned, last year had over 20% growth in GDP, so massive. That being said, the number of people living in poverty in the villages near the industrial park grew. So people who are now, you're talking about regions where people do not have access to electricity. They're reliant on traditional livelihoods, fishing, farming for sustain themselves, and they gather water from rivers. And so, if their GDP grows up 20%, but say they were making the equivalent of $100 the year before, and now they're making 20% more, that doesn't necessarily account for the fact that their cost of, their standard of living has probably decreased. They're now breathing toxic air from coal plants, from smelters. They're now having to buy water because the rivers that go through their village are orange with tailings runoffs. So I think just using only one indicator of GDP as a demonstration that this system is working well for Indonesia doesn't necessarily make sense. One thing that many Indonesian civil society organizations are also talking about is the fact that, yes, people are making a lot of money, but it's not necessarily the general public that's making a lot of money. You have, really powerful interests. You have, families that have owned coal plants and large plantations that are invested in the nickel industry. So just tearing apart, this basic case study, the fact that, the country has made a lot of money. And then just maybe briefly on the WTO case, for if anyone's not familiar, the European Union challenged Indonesia's export ban of raw ore on the promise that it was going to impact companies based in the EU. The WTO found that Indonesia's rules did go against the WTO's rules. And so immediately Indonesia challenged that, but the WTO has a defunct appellate system, so there's essentially no way of trying that. It's notable that the US government is also partially responsible for filling the seats on that, and so there is a role of the US in ensuring that whether or not this is resolved or not. At the end of the day, the Indonesian government has a rule, and it's, it is providing a lot of jobs and opportunity. But that being said, the rush to secure these transition minerals is not an excuse for human rights abuses, and it is not an excuse for significant amounts of deforestation, for building new coal plants that are, providing so many more emissions when the whole idea is providing these minerals that are largely going to more developed communities. In these communities around these industrial parks do not have 24-hour access to electricity, so have no use for electric vehicles. So when we're understanding, what is the role, but we should also be looking at, what is the burden that is put on some of the most vulnerable communities.
Excellent.
Okay, yeah. And I just want to try to respond to the EU lawsuit against Indonesia. Actually, I don't know much about this case, but I did a case study about some environmental NGOs that brought a lawsuit against the governor of Bali Island, the governor of province, because the government approved the coal power plant about 5 or 6 years ago. Actually, this power plant was invested by a Chinese company, and with the credit from a Chinese financial bank. So actually, this case, even the defendant is not a Chinese company, is an Indonesian partner, Indonesia government. But actually, we heard that Chinese companies involved in the lawsuit cases by providing a lot of information or recruit a lawyer. So that's also the strategy for many environmental NGOs. They just recruit many public interest lawyers to brought legal cases, and for environmental cases. Actually, that's really give a lot of pressure, not only to Indonesian government, but also to Chinese investors. And also after this lawsuit case, even the environmental organization, they lost the case, but after this lawsuit, the Bali province, the governor of the Bali province made a commitment, no more coal power plant. It still have some influence for future work. So for the critical mineral program. Actually, I don't know much about, but the lawyer, the Zhang Jingjing, she is an expert in this area, and I heard she actually worked with many environmental lawyers in West Africa, in South America for those legal cases, and I do think it's really not the PRL, public interest litigation, is a very helpful and valuable method to clean up the critical mining and also clean up the BRI programs.
Excellent, thank you. Hongqiao, any comments on some of those questions?
Maybe I can very quickly share some of my thoughts on deep sea mining, a very depressing issue. Back, like, I think 10 years ago, when I was looking at the rare earth competition following China banned export to Japan, and then the US-China so-called trade war on rare earths, we were already at that time looking at different deep sea mining options. And obviously, the international legislation on deep sea mining hasn't really improved that much since I first did my research. The deep sea basically is a very messy area that there's no oversight. From the ecological point of view, I personally wouldn't go for it. And I think yes, we know problems on the land in the continent, on the continents are already very challenging, but I would really hope that we can work together to look at and to look for good governance models. And I think some of the things that were mentioned by the two other panelists can be, I mean, I've seen a few open areas of where we can put efforts in the future, right? Krista was sharing that in some of the around some of the industrial parks, local people are suffering. Their living situation actually declined. They didn't benefit from the mining activities or the processing or the GDP growth at the national level. That was the same challenge when China contributed, let's say, produced over 99% of rare earth minerals for the rest of the world back in, let's say, 15, 20 years ago. I think we are smart enough to know that we shouldn't repeat the same problems and replicate that all around the world. And I might be naive and innocent, but I do hope different stakeholders can really work together to find out some solutions, and we can start from something small, like the captive cobalt plants that was also repeatedly mentioned by two of the other panelists. The option is simple and it's feasible. A lot of Chinese industrial parks are now going net zero. Why not do that? Do the same, introduce the same model to Indonesians' nickel processing industrial parks or elsewhere. These are small steps that can be adapted and adopted by local policymakers, showing guidelines, increasing their bargaining power. And what we have learned some lessons on other minerals, right? The Great Lake Initiative, not perfect, but we have experience there. And as I said, I might be naive and innocent, and I do sincerely hope that we are working towards solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hongqiao. Well, you're actually speaking to I think a room full of naive and innocent people, because I think we all are here because we believe that we can get some kind of agreement to move forward on these issues in a positive direction. So we embrace you on that. We have a few more minutes in this session. We have one question, and then I'm going to follow up with two other questions and give you one last opportunity to say your piece. Yes.
So another question kind of touched on this, but I'm curious about limits to growth regarding these minerals. So I'm guessing because they're non-renewable, as low-hanging fruit is mined, it'll become more and more resource intensive to mine what is remaining. And so do you have a sense of projections of how much we have, and is it going to be enough for this whole, for the whole world to transition to renewables? And is scarcity kind of like on policymakers' minds, or is there enough low-hanging fruit to do that?
Excellent. Question is limits to growth with respect to minerals. Do we have enough minerals to power this clean energy revolution? And do politicians have any sense that there might be some scarcity, if not in the short term, then seriously in the mid and longer term? Yes.
Thanks so much for this panel. I guess I'm curious, in the US, critical mineral designation is often framed in terms of national security. Specifically, there's been a new antimoney, germanium, et cetera, ban. I'm wondering if the Chinese state has a little bit more of a nuanced perspective on the full suite of energy transition minerals and how we think about the relationship between national security objectives and future Chinese trade attenuation around these raw materials, and thinking about what the sort of geo ramifications thereof are.
So how does China think about the national security?
In the sort of stack of priorities in the US, always these as a national security thing first and foremost. Is that the same approach that the Chinese state is taking here?
Good. United States puts national security usually number one in terms of critical raw materials and securing access to them. What about China? Does China see critical raw materials through that national security framework? Yeah, those are great questions. I don't really have anything to add to them, though I do want to emphasize this proposal that Hongqiao had put forward. I mean, you have this crazy situation. You have coal power plants being used to process nickel in Indonesia, nickel that supposedly, or at least theoretically, could go into clean energy. Doesn't make any sense. So what if we saw some kind of a pilot project in which you had clean energy extracting clean minerals? Obviously, there are problems with extraction in general, but we can talk about those, but at least this one particular contradiction. And there was one other small question. You had mentioned a grievance mechanism that had been established by the Chinese government. Has anybody used that grievance mechanism, or is it simply on paper? So I'm going to start with Hongqiao, and any final comments, you can answer any of those questions or talk about your cat, but this is your last shot. Thank you, Hongqiao.
Back to my cat. I think everybody loves the cat. Yeah, I think two of the questions. Which one? Sorry, I'm looking at my note. I personally, so some of the researchers on the ground I've been talking to, they were sharing with me that based on their interactions with some of the Chinese company, let's say, or the representatives, they do feel the pressure to either clean up or respond to, mitigate at least the risk from geopolitical tension, trade wars, trade limitations, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at the moment they need a little bit of hand-holding, some creative, innovative way to show them how to, and to bridge the dialogues. I think that could be something to go forward with. Whether China views critical minerals as national security challenge as the US. I mean, as John just outlined, some of the critical minerals are seen as the national strategic resources. So on that, at least from that perspective, it is part of the national security. And we look at China, like our President Xi Jinping's new, I think it was called a new comprehensive view or perspective on national security. I think one of that is climate security and energy security, if I don't get that wrong, or resource security. So critical minerals hit at least the two perspectives of that comprehensive view on national security. So it might not come out, it might not be perceived or published or neutralized as a list of national security priorities, but it's definitely on the agenda and it's considered as a national security issue. However, I guess Chinese view is the position, the Chinese government's position is slightly, or let's say, distinctly different from the US, because China produces a lot of critical minerals domestically and controls, let's say, has control over the supply chain in many of the countries. So it has more dominance, more power over the influence of the supply chain. So when China views critical minerals as a national security issue, I think it views it through the lens of how would the future conflicts or the competitions over critical mineral supply chain or the geopolitical tensions, if they escalate further, or the trade wars, et cetera, how would that impact China's other geopolitical agendas or international relations agendas? I think that would be China's view to this. It's very different from the US view, that worrying that it won't have that access to minerals. So I guess that's my 2 cents in this question. And if that's my final statement, I thank you very much. And I will show the cat again.
Thank you, Hongqiao. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. And about the agreement mechanism, first, it's not proposed by the government, it's proposed by the government-initiated industry association, and even they have a strong connection with the government, but it's just so-called NGOs, but with a strong tier with the government. And actually, because of the lack of information and transparency, we don't know how about the mechanism, how many complaints they received, how many responses they have given, and also what's the satisfied rate. But I think that's something for NGOs of host BRI countries can do, is to give education, provide training to community, affect communities, and to encourage local communities to use this mechanism. And no matter it's just symbolic or it's just something on to take advantage of this mechanism. So that's the first thing for local communities. For NGOs like us as a Chinese NGO, that's what we want to do, is try to engage with the CCCMC, is this government-initiated industry association, because actually they just showed simple that they want to be more responsible, they want to have a better CSR performance, they want to have a good reputation. So that can be a chance for Chinese NGOs to build up the dialogue and the communication with them. Actually, I tried several times. I got the leader of the association's contact information, tried to reach out to them, but he never responded to me. But because this, actually they have good they have some partnership with another NGO based in the US called WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, because this NGO is international NGOs with more influence, but for NGOs like us, it's more aggressive, not so impactful, so they don't respond to us. But we still have our strategy, so some information we talk with the WCS, and also last year they have a workshop and invite many international NGOs to participate, including one based in France called the Paris Forum. And actually, some suggestions, some recommendations through our connection with those French-based organizations finally delivered to this industry association. It's more like a joint campaign for different kind of NGOs. But it's still a lot of work to do, and it's not perfect, and we don't know what's the real purpose, why they have this the agreement mechanism. But for us, it's one of our opportunities.
Excellent, thank you. Krista, you have to answer all the remaining questions.
Great, happy to. I think one thing on kind kind of the question around limits of growth and scarcity. I mean, I think it's a real valid question of like, do we need to be mining all of these minerals? Like, what minerals have already been mined? Can we, remine active mining areas to ensure that all of those available minerals are taken out of the ground rather than destroying primary rainforests in places like the DRC and Indonesia and the Amazon basin. A shout out to a really helpful report by RMI. I think it's called the Battery Loop. It came out in the fall, but it finds like very achievable pathways to essentially mining all of the minerals needed for the energy transition by mid-century. And so that includes things around policies. So that means, in the United States, not replacing every single gas-powered vehicle with an electric vehicle, investing in public transit and other alternative methods of transportation, because it really is electric vehicle batteries that use such a significant amount of these minerals when we're talking about cobalt and lithium and nickel. But also, investing in recycling and reuse and, figuring out ways of repurposing, batteries and materials that have already been used. What we've seen in Indonesia is really just like a race to do it as quick as possible. And, that's just not building a 5,000 hectare, $10 billion industrial park in 2 years means that you probably aren't going to effectively, consult all the impacted local communities and get true, free, prior informed consent from Indigenous people. So I think, understanding that, yes, we need a really fast energy transition, but it should not be at the cost of human rights and of the environment that we're actually trying to protect.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to everybody. And a special big thanks to Hongqiao, because we here are enjoying a 3:27 p.m. Event, but Hongqiao is staying up very late to join us. She's in Europe at the moment. So thank you, Hongqiao, for staying up for us. And thank your cat, too. We're going to take I'm sorry, go on.
No, I said it was a pleasure.
Okay. We're going to take a 5 to 10 minute break, and then we'll bring up the next panel. So stretch, we have a bathroom over there, there's water around the corner, and folks online, well, you can do whatever you want to do for the next 5 to 10 minutes.
We should chat sometime about the CCCMC RMI.
Hey, for those of us who'd like to shoot, how should we connect this?
Yeah,
Should
and
we join active?
So I can probably share mine.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
I'm
I'm just pretending.
Would it be okay if I said again? As usual,
many more
like
and
in the
more
last
Chinese
minute idea from somebody else in the previous panel. That's a great idea.
Watching is very controversial. We can identify whether you are really involved in a family company or you just
I wrote to CCCMC.
Thank you, Nat. I think that went smoothly.
And I was like, you should talk to these companies. They never responded to me.
I've been trying to order like little plastic
they
things that
have
you
a
can always
list
use.
of
But
those friendly NGOs.
So I was at the OECD forum last
Which
year
one
on responsible mineral
does it matter which
supply
two I
chains, and
put
there
next
was a
to you?
lot of people from the mechanism. It's in May in Paris. If they want to go, like, you could find them and talk to them.
Yeah, that's also one of our strategies. Sometimes we try to reach out by email from this fund. We just work in and to have a face-to-face communications. But the really, I think the real thing is because there's no monitoring, no check system. Because they really should be someone to criticize outside, give them some pressure. But for WCS, sometimes it's also very controversial because they try to help.
I know Global Witness too.
Global Witness, also some.
Did you send it already?
Yeah, But Global Witness, they are also very neutral for but for WCS, yeah.
Good talk.
Job.
So I'm Brian Check, and blah, 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 as a center for the advancement of the steady state. I'll give it a minute, stabilize, and
So you're also based here in DC?
Yeah, across the river. And I noticed you mentioned a few times some work evidently with the Wildlife Conservation Society. That's where we come from originally.
They also have their office, they also have their program. So we just discussed their program working together with the mineral company in China because for China NGOs still not controversial whether for NGOs should help with companies more like endorse the company. But the performance of those Chinese mineral companies is not so perfect because still someone should keep on monitoring like your call.
You guys ever at all talked about trying to talk to someone in the Chinese government, American, any government,
Okay, welcome back. Thank you everyone for taking a break and for hanging on online. A reminder, we have Spanish interpretation. And because we have Spanish interpretation, I'm going to speak slower than I did before. We have a second panel. We're going to focus here on the impacts of mining and mineral extraction. We're going to start with big picture, and we're going to get down to smaller picture. We have three wonderful presenters. I'm going to give you their bios, and then I'll put it in the chat for those folks online. All the way to my left is Thea Riofrancos. She is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and a fellow at the Transnational Institute, which happens to be our European friend and partner of the Institute for Policy Studies. Rebecca Ray is a senior academic researcher at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. She leads GDP Center Research, that's Global Policy Center, or Global Development Policy, not gross national product. GDP Center Research on China and Latin America, and Maya Seeger. And Maya's joining us online from Chile. She is a journalist and specialist in communications and community engagement and development. She is director of Sustentarse, a nonprofit organization based in Chile. For those of you who are joining for the first time now online, this is a conversation here at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and this is a event co-sponsored with Justice is Global. We're going to start with a couple of questions, one question for each of you. Again, it's the 5 to 10 minute rule, which I hardly even had to use. I created these things and didn't even have to use them. And then we're going to open it up again to comments and questions, both online and people in the audience. And again, I want to emphasize that we have a lot of expertise in the audience. So I want to encourage everyone in the audience to just jump right in after we've had some brief comments. Thea, can you describe the different strategies of resource nationalism? We've heard a little bit in the first panel, certainly the example of Indonesia, but used by Latin American states to leverage outside investment from China, from the West, to develop energy transition minerals. How have states in the region done? Have they done anything to reduce the risk of sacrifice zones that are associated with mining and extraction? And how will Trump-style politics in the United States and in Argentina, for instance, affect this dynamic? So you're going to give us the big picture.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So maybe two little caveats before I begin. One is I'm going to zoom 3 levels of abstraction out from John's question, but I'll get there because I think some even broader context might be helpful to answer those. And if I run out of time, I'll just save some of the more particular points for the Q&A. And then the second, and this maybe goes without saying, but stuff will be repeated from the prior panel. I didn't know what the panelists would say. So hopefully repetition is good for cumulative learning, but it's not a lot. But there are, I think, some similar points that were already said by our brilliant first panel that I'll reiterate a little bit. But I want to kind of take this at a really high level view to start, because I think it's important to understand just how turbulent, how unpredictable, how dangerous, and how uncertain the current global picture is. Just as a kind of note of caution around our analysis, but also like a note of urgency for progressive analysis and for progressive power building, because the situation is very bleak, right? So I just want to start, I know I'm speaking to the choir, but I just want to say it anyway, 2024, the warmest year on record, we're breaching 1.5 degrees. Amid this climate crisis and intersecting with it, we have a return of quite dangerous great power conflict, which only threatens to intensify with Trump in the White House, but also with a range of right-wing governments in Europe as well, right? And so we have a lot of bellicose governments around the world during a really scary climate crisis. we also, kind of related to these facts, have the return of industrial policy, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. There are different types of industrial policies. I think some of them are quite progressive, others not so much. But the reason I'm bringing this up here is that we have a kind of global world in which economics, as well as the energy transition itself, are increasingly structured by state intervention. And those state interventions are in many cases very motivated by security concerns, right? And so that's the picture that we're operating in. And so I like to use the term that I borrow from Thea Roberts and others who have coined it and defined it, of geoeconomics, right? A situation in which the economy and national security are increasingly fused. But it's also worth noting the other meaning of geo, right? Geo also can make us think about the geological substrate of a lot of this kind of economic production, right? So we can maybe use it in both senses. Just a few more overarching points, and then I'll get a little closer to John's questions, which are, when we think about the energy transition globally, we can think of how deeply uneven and unequal it is, right? That doesn't mean there hasn't been progress. There has been. I mean, experts are now debating that this might be China's first year with plateaued emissions from its electricity sector, which would be an enormous development, right? So really not understating the progress that has been made, but it's uneven, it's unequal in many senses of the word. There are countries that are not making progress, or there are countries that are relegated to the most toxic, contaminated, and extractive parts of the energy transition, right? So something that Krista and others spoke a lot about earlier. But I think that another way to think about this is that we remain very much in a process of energy addition. And the reason I bring that up, meaning we're adding, and again, the coal piece that we were just talking about, we're adding energy sources, we're not subtracting or substituting them. And what this means for some of our current discussion is that we have a lot of types of extraction expanding at once, right? Which I think creates a real governance challenge, right? If you're in Indonesia, you're from an advocacy or perspective, or even a governmental one, it's like, how are we regulating the emissions from the coal and regulating the harms from the nickel, right? And so, I'm really glad that example was brought up. I was going to bring it up myself to illustrate this point. And so this is the kind of global kind of geopolitical terrain in which critical minerals are being expanded, mined, but also contested politically. So for me, this raises a key question that is like a riff on the whole theme of today and tomorrow. So, how do we evaluate the possibilities and risks for global South mineral producers in the context that I just laid out? Like, what opportunities are there? What risks do we need to be attentive to? And why even talk about the global South so centrally? And I think one has to do with, obviously, just attentive to global inequality means we should focus on the countries that are often on the losing end of global economic transactions. But a little more specifically, the global South is just where the lion's share of minerals are slated to come from for all of these energy transition supply chains. The main places, if we look at the forecasters, are Latin America, Africa, and Indonesia. Like, Indonesia stands out on its own because it's such a major provider. But other than Indonesia, it's Latin America and Africa that are so those are the places where this is a really live question, right? And so for me, we're in a new era of geoeconomics, of more industrial policy, of great powers instituting trade bans and doing all this onshoring stuff. I'll talk more about, when I have time or at some point in a moment. So we're no longer in an era of either pure US hegemony, right? Because we have great power competition. The US remains hegemonic in some domains, but certainly not all. And we're also no longer in an era of unquestioned neoliberal hegemony of like free trade and, that type of thing. Not saying we're in a post-neoliberal era, but there's more questioning of it. So let's just say, like, compared to the 90s and the early 2000s, which was another moment of a mining boom. Let's not forget that, right? There was a major commodity boom then and a lot of expansion of mining in Latin America and Africa then. Compared to then, when like US hegemony and free trade was more hegemonic, does this new conjuncture offer new opportunities to global South countries? Like, does it help them that the US is engaging in more industrial policy by, for example, legitimating industrial policy, where for so long, global South countries have basically been denied some of these developmental kind of avenues? Or does the competition between the US and China, is that more beneficial than just a single hegemon, right? And so I think these are ways to think about the question. And then the last way I'd frame it is that, you know, the negative side of this would be, no, there are no new opportunities created. I'm exaggerating to make a point, right? No new opportunities created, but instead what we have is just more great power competition to grab the resources of these countries, right? And so that's the kind of like worst case scenario. How much time have I eaten up?
You have 4.5 minutes.
Okay, great. So we're gonna do like a third of what I planned, but that's okay. That's how it goes. So I think, you know, there are a couple of inroads here to answer these questions, and it's that, which is obviously a collective task, but I'll lay out a couple of ideas. So we have absolutely seen global South countries get governments, I should be more specific, get more assertive about industrial policy, about resource nationalism over the past several years, but definitely picking up pace recently. And so whether or not that's a response to new openings of this great power conflict and the diminished legitimacy of neoliberal policies, you know, we could argue what the causes of this are, but it's certainly happening, right? And we're not necessarily seeing the kind of like US-led or EU-led backlash. I mean, we had the question on the WTO, but we also had the answer to it, which is like, it's literally because Trump won't appoint someone to the appellate court during his prior term that like, we're not even like the EU can't like fully dismantle what Indonesia is doing, right? So there's some backlash, but it's muted. It's not the same as we've seen in prior eras. So, you know, for example, Bolivia, Mexico, and Chile, to very varying degrees, have quote unquote nationalized or at the very least established state-owned companies or national strategies for their lithium industries, right? So in those three countries, there's been forward movement in increasing the role of the state in these sectors. A ton of contradictions and tensions there that I won't get into now, but just to flag them for later. There's also another set of policies, which I'm really glad the prior panel already defined as downstreaming policies. So those are less about nationalizing control of the raw material, though they can go along with it, and more about ensuring that the country moves up the supply chain or down the stream, two different metaphors for the same thing, but basically to go beyond just like the trap of resource extraction. So inspired by Indonesia, which we heard a lot about earlier, also Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Tanzania have implemented export bans on their raw materials, on lithium in particular. And in Chile, it's a softer approach, but there are major financial incentives for companies to use Chilean lithium to make batteries in Chile. And some Chinese companies are taking advantage of those incentives, right? You also see, and this is, we're now getting to like more speculative, but there have been some recent efforts over the past few years in Latin America to kind of replicate some of what OPEC does for oil in lithium, right? So this is the so-called lithium OPEC that has not come to be and probably won't come to be in that form, and I'm happy to answer questions as to why. But I think it's interesting enough that Chile, Bolivia, Mexico, Argentina under the prior government, of course, and Brazil have even had meetings about like what would it mean to coordinate our policies and do some market kind of structuring from the producer end, just like OPEC does with oil. Like what would that mean for lithium, right? So to even have those conversations is, I think, indicative. And then some of that also aligns with even more speculative but very important conversations around regional integration in Latin America. So again, I'm kind of going in a ladder of we have national resource ownership and state-owned companies in some cases. We have export bans and or incentives to do downstreaming in other cases. We have producer coordination discussions, and then we have discussions of what if instead of exporting all this lithium, we used it in Latin America for regional supply chains, and also we coordinated, so the places with the rare earths and the places with the copper and the places with the lithium coordinated so we could keep all those resources within the region and produce the electric buses and bikes and that we need for our societies here using our own resources, right? The last thing I'll say for now is that maybe to hint towards places that we can pick up in the discussion, because there are things I would at least like to explore a bit more, which is how that resource nationalism and industrial policy and developmentalism in the global South, how is that interacting with the other side of the world, meaning the global North, doing more securitization of its own resources, more onshoring of mining within the global North, supply chain-wide securitization. Like, how do these two intersect? Because it's not actually an easy question to answer. I have some provisional thoughts. How might that change under Trump? I likewise have some provisional thoughts. And maybe the last thing for now is two last things for now. Okay, I lied, but I'm really done. I'm not even look at my computer anymore. The last thing for now is like, should progressives prefer like more mining in the US versus, had been the Trump and Biden and now Trump 2 goals to like increase mining in the US? Like, is that something we should like say thumbs up to, because that means less extractive zones in the rest of the world and the US paying its own like kind of ecological costs for once? Or should we be more skeptical? And I have some thoughts on that. Again, I'm just kind of germinating discussion a little bit here. And then the last is like looking beyond what's on the table in terms of policymakers in Latin America, even the most progressive ones like the Boriches, the Petros, et cetera, the Lulas, like beyond existing proposals, what would be like the most ambitious eco-social, I'll just use that term, industrial policies for Latin America? Like can we kind of take some lessons from our comrades in Latin America kind of on the front lines doing some of the most ambitious policy work and protest work around these things, and think through like an even kind of bigger picture set of reforms that would really change, I think, the kind of economic relations of mining around the world. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that was only 1/3. I'm very, you know, the rule of show business is leave them wanting more.
Okay.
So clearly, I want more. I think they want more too. But before we get more, we're going to you, Becky, to hear your answer to my question, and that is energy transition minerals, as your annual report on Chinese-Latin American relations points out, and you should check out their annual report on this. This is a plug for your annual report, which is very useful. Energy transition minerals now account for approximately half of global trade in the unprocessed forms of lithium carbonate, copper ores, and concentrates. Half of global trade. I mean, that's astounding. You do a lot of work on the financing of this extraction. How have the multiple forms of financing affected attempts by civil society to achieve transparency and accountability? And what civil society strategies have worked? And you have a PowerPoint presentation.
I do. Thank you so much for your patience with my insistence on showing pictures. I am one of those people who thinks in infographics. So if I'm going to share my thoughts with you, it's going to have to be in the form of pictures. Thank you very much, John, for sharing that. One caveat from me is that you'll see I'm referencing transition minerals and not critical minerals. I'm limiting my work and my thoughts specifically to those minerals with applicability for renewable energy and electric mobility, and not those minerals that get lumped into critical minerals because they have military uses. That's kind of outside of our scope as a development policy center. We can talk more about that later. Now, usually people say they hate to go after a great speaker, but I'm thrilled to go after Thea because I'm going to talk about perhaps the other partner at the table, who's the money, financing, and civil society, and how strategies can adapt for a changing landscape and who's financing, which governments are at the table that civil society and national governments are working with. Do you mind if I just click through, or do you want to do that? Thank you. So this era of competition is bringing fragmentation in financing, and it's bringing fragmentation in environmental and social governance. I've spent the last decade of my life mostly studying environmental and social governance of Chinese outbound economic activity, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly in South America, and particularly in mining. So I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about this with y'all today. In order to get this, I have to kind of walk you through a very brief history of the stages of investment in minerals in South America in the 21st century, and how governance of the environmental and social factors has changed, how civil society has had to shift their strategy, and then bring us to the current and future prospects. And the possibility that in this fragmentation, that working on where the money comes from can be a pinch point. Fewer decision makers to be able to hold actors accountable. It's not the answer, but it's an answer, part of the portfolio of answers to accompany the great points that Thea's made. So we've talked about how important the global South is, but I need you to understand how important China is. When we talk about US-China competition, we are talking about North Atlantic countries trying to get into a market that they have been largely absent from. So these are a few trade diagrams. They're called Sankey diagrams. This is from an upcoming report that we'll have out next month. The first diagram on the left is all of global trade. You see exports on the left, importers on the right by their regions. It's very tidy. It's also, of course, very unequal. Europe and North America, and here North America excludes anyone in Latin America or the Caribbean. So that's just Canada, the US, and Europe, accounts for about half of exports and over half of imports. Whereas if we think about the global South, and we might define that as Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, China, and the rest of lower and middle income Asia, that's 80% of the world's population, and it's about a third of global trade. So that's the level of inequality and tidiness, and that is business as usual for trade. But that second graph is transition mineral ores and concentrates. This includes all of the transition minerals that the World Bank has identified as being core to the transition. So that's everything from iron, which of course steel is a crucial part of renewable energy, to much newer developed minerals like lithium. And here we see China represents over 2/3 of global imports and is mostly buying from Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. We really see high income Asia there. That's Australia. They're the world's top iron producer. And if we eliminate copper, aluminum, and iron, which don't really need to grow anymore for the renewable energy, they've already met their growth targets for those goals. And we just look at the smaller minerals that are expected to need to continue to grow for those 2050 targets, which according to the World Bank projections, we see over half of global trade is just China buying from Africa, South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean rather, and developing Asia. So Latin America, China represents over half of global lithium trade. Indonesia, China represents over half of global nickel trade. Africa, China exports represent about 80% of global chromium trade. So this is a sector, I need you to understand how important China is. When the US talks about competing with China, they are talking about beginning to get into a market where China has been active for a long time. Pretty much ever since Ronald Reagan took down those solar panels. So we've left a void and someone else is in it. So now to give you an understanding of how this impacts environmental and social governance of mining in Latin America, we can think about 3 stages of mining investment in the region since just the turn of the century. So as a reminder, y'all probably already know this, but 20th century environmental and social governance of international investment was largely something that was pursued by focusing on Washington, D.C. as a pinch point. The MDBs, the multinational corporations that were regulated through D.C., and the developing country governments that were supported militarily or economically through D.C. And so D.C. was the natural pinch point where activists and academics around the world focused their strategies. And it worked. This is how we got the modern era of multilateral development bank safeguards, such as they are. The International Financial Corporation's performance standards came from that effort. But everything changed in Latin America at the beginning of the 21st century with the China boom. This is overwhelmingly a story of, now, they didn't just arrive in the 21st century. In some cases, they arrived well earlier than that. But we really see the activity take off at the beginning of the 21st century with the China minerals boom in the region. And this is largely, although not entirely, a story of Western companies fleeing higher regulations, higher taxations, and Chinese SOEs being happy to buy into that standard, being willing to meet those higher standards. We have a very different approach to environmental and social governance, though, and I'll talk about what those differences are. But civil society had to adapt to different ways of interacting with the decision makers. When it comes to transition minerals, though, we're not seeing Chinese SOEs in the region. We're seeing private Chinese firms in the region, the Jizins, the Junefields, the CATLs. These have a different way of engaging in environmental and social governance affairs, less focused on government-to-government relations and more likely to act like their Western private counterparts. So now we have a very fragmented environmental and social governance strategy. How on earth is academia and civil society and the policy world supposed to focus on all of these moving targets? In addition to all of that, now with the resurgence of the North Atlantic regions trying to get back into the game, we see a resurgence of both public and private money from multilateral and national sources. Get their money from public banks, whether or not they are private. So when we're talking about step 1, those are SOEs who are definitely getting their money from Chinese state banks. Step 2, we've got Chinese private enterprises who are still getting their money from public Chinese banks. And step three, the return of MDBs and Western DFIs. Again, we're talking about public banks. So it's not the answer, but it's an important throughput. So about 8 years ago, our colleagues at the University of the Pacific in Peru and a team of regional experts and ourselves put out a book in Latin America compared to their Western counterparts in the most important sectors where they were active. These were overwhelmingly extractive enterprises, overwhelmingly mining and oil, overwhelmingly SOEs. And what we found was the SOEs approached it as a G-to-G relationship. They primarily interacted with their national governments, not with local civil society. This meant, however, the good news is they were willing to rise to whatever the environmental and social standards were of the national government. They were also willing to fall to whatever the national environmental and social standards of the government were. In other words, there was great flexibility to live up to or down to local standards, which meant strategies had to adapt to focus on national government policies, but there was policy space, right? Unlike the Western private companies that they replaced, these companies were not bringing Latin American governments to ICSID or other international arbitration courts to complain about minimum wage increases or environmental impact assessment requirements. So there was a possibility of work and progress, and work and progress has been done. It is certainly not done, but the work is ongoing and has made progress. However, national standards aren't the only thing we can think about. This is a graph of Amazon Basin countries' environmental and social regulatory changes since 1990. We put this together with our friends at the BRICS Policy Center in Rio. They have a library of Amazon Basin environmental and social protections at the national level. We've coded those here. Gray is everything establishing a baseline. Blue is everything strengthening a baseline, and red is everything rolling back protections. And then that black dotted line is the export prices. So you can see they really react in response to the export prices. When those export prices are going up in that middle category, that's the China boom. And that's where we see the standards really strengthen. There's political pressure to make sure this boom doesn't hurt communities or the ecosystems they depend on. But as soon as those prices begin to drop, right at 2012, that's where we see a tremendous rollback across left and right governments across the region in the name of expediting new investments, even though we already know Chinese SOEs are fine with your having high standards. It's not an impediment. But nonetheless, there's still the cultural expectation in bureaucracies around the world that if you want more investment, the first thing you have to do is roll back environmental and social standards. It doesn't work, but they still do it. So the problem here is not just this, but the fact that transition mineral prices are even more volatile. Just since Biden took office 4 years ago, the price of lithium globally has sextupled, has risen sixfold, and then fallen right back to where it was at the beginning of his term. That's astonishing volatility. You can't have your environmental and social protections on that much of a roller coaster if they're going to lay any kind of groundwork for a just and sustainable transition. The other complication is that transition minerals are really being mined by private Chinese companies, not public Chinese companies. They're not as deferential to national government standards. Thank you. Here we see the number of investor-state dispute settlement claims brought by Chinese and on the right, US companies over the last 20 years. Obviously, China doesn't have nearly as many as the US, but it's growing rapidly and it's primarily private. I have so much more I want to talk to you about the growth in standards, the progress towards standards, some of what we learned earlier today about new standards being developed by Chinese state banks, and the fact that it took decades for the World Bank to establish their standards. We're seeing faster than that progress on the Chinese front, but of course, many of us would have loved to have seen that progress done yesterday. So I really want to talk with you all in the discussion about where we are in that process and talk about the dynamic that happens between DFI standards and national government standards, because you can't really have success with one and not the other. There's always a way to circumvent if your partner isn't holding you accountable. And then finally, point out the fact that MDBs, which are going to be more active in this next section because of their connection to Washington and because of their mandate to increase public goods for a livable planet, which means renewable energy and electric mobility, are primarily supporting national government policy and institutional capacity building, like to meet transparency requirements and such, in the lowest income countries, which are the only ones that can get concessional finance for policy lending right now. That's not where the transition minerals are being exported from. The transition minerals are being exported mostly from medium income countries. which means there's no institutional policy support from MDBs for that. So we're finding ourselves back in the cycle of pursuing the output without reinforcing the national government standards that are so core as the other half of the partnership. And that's really dangerous. But the good news is there are opportunities for the World Bank and other MDBs to step in. There's opportunities for Western as well as Chinese DFIs to play a really constructive role here. And this kind of bifurcated approach of making progress working on the national level, making progress working with the lenders, perhaps makes more sense than being entirely scattered to the wind with each organization being overwhelmed by the sheer number of investors, public and private, that they have to interface with directly, which is simply perhaps impossible. So very happy to explore all of these topics that I also didn't get to in the discussion. Thank you for holding me accountable.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm sure we will have an opportunity to get to all of the points that you were hoping to get to. I'm really intrigued by, I like this expression pinch point, like finding where the pinch point is. Where can you have maximum impact on the smallest number of people? You know, that's a really interesting concept. Okay, Maya, you have been extraordinarily patient. You've actually been online this entire time, and we all appreciate that. And I'm going to ask you your question as soon as I get to the right page. You're in Chile, and your organization has been tracking Chinese investments in mining throughout Latin America, but especially in Chile. So we've gotten a little bit of how some of these investments have changed. Becky gave us, and Thea gave us some background on some of the changes in the investments. But can you tell us a little bit more about how you see it coming from Chile, and how have the social impacts of these investments, how have they changed in Chile and throughout Latin America? And have civil society actions had any specific impacts on Chinese operations in terms of environmental and labor standards? I mean, we heard that it seems to follow the price of commodities, the regulatory framework, waxing and waning. I'm curious from your point of view, where you've seen impact that civil society has had on Chinese investments in mining and extraction. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Maya. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me today and to bring in a voice from Latin America, which is the focus of the present panel. I don't know how to start. There are so many issues to address. The first thing I'm going to say is that from Latin America, we are observing with a lot of interest the emergence of a multipolar world and seeing and trying to find out how it will benefit our region and our countries as well. Yeah. We have been always dependent on the global north. Now we have also China as an important actor in the region. And so it's very interesting what's going on. I'm going to just point out a frame of information that's important to understand what's going on transition minerals in Latin America. Sustentarse, that's my organization in Chile, is part of the collective of Chinese financing, investment, human rights, and the environment, CICTA. That's a network of civil society organizations in the region that monitors the impact of business and financial activities in the region. Yeah, we have been very active in documenting cases, in bringing experiences into international forums, etc. So the first thing I want to state is Latin America is the most important region for probably the two most important minerals for the energy transition. I will adopt the term that Rebecca Ray used, not critical minerals, but transition minerals. And that is copper and it's lithium. Three countries in Latin America stand for 32.5% of copper mine production in the world, that are Chile in the first place with 24% of total, Argentina and Brazil. We have also We have also activities in Panama and in Ecuador nowadays. And the same countries are also very important for lithium production. Chile is #1 in the region, #2 in the world. Argentina is #4 in the world, and Brazil is #5 in mine production. But we are also very important in terms of reserves. And for measured and indicated resources. In the case of lithium, we have 56.7, almost 57% of measured and indicated resources and 47.5% of reserves. This according to data from the US Geological Service from 2024. Yeah, so this explains why this region is so important in this geoeconomic fight to access these minerals and to assure security in supply of these transitional minerals. So this explains why in the past years we have received in the region many visits of Laura Richardson. She is the former commander of the US Southern Command, who stated that she wanted to assure that America belongs to America, the Doctrine Monroe, and she wanted to assure that the US will become dominant again in our region. Our region has been neglected by the United States in probably in the last 10 years or more. And China has taken advantage of that. And it became, first of all, the main destination for raw material. The main destination of our raw materials go to China. Since 2015, China has been Latin America's second or first business partner. It's becoming the first. And South America, for sure, is the first business partner. We are the second destination for China's investments in the world, mostly focused on energy, oil and gas, and renewables, critical minerals, infrastructure, and food. China has become the biggest money lender between 2005 and 2022. Now China is lending directly to his enterprises, state-owned or private enterprises. So it's not lending money to the governments since 2023, almost nothing. And China's economic influence has affected directly and indirectly fragile territories and local communities. Yeah, I want to share a few data from a report we produced with SIGTA and published in 2023 and 2024. Let me just go for the slides. Give me 1 second, please. Do you see? Can you see?
Yes.
Well, you asked about our influence in trying to impact and to create some shifts in Chinese behavior. This through thick that we have been participating in different spaces at the United Nations to visualize, to show how China is complying with its extraterritorial obligations. And in 2023, during the 4th Universal Periodic Review of the People's Republic of China, we presented or we prepared a report with 28 cases of human rights violations and harm to the environment and communities in 9 countries in the region. Half of the cases were related to the mining sector. So that shows how important it is. And it was very important because this report was taken into account by the countries that were participating in this periodic review. And many of our recommendations were communicated to the Chinese government. And the Chinese government, they admitted most of our observation, and that's really, really important. It makes a difference. So I want just to show very shortly what projects were documented in the human rights and environmental violations in countries like Argentina related to lithium, principally in Brazil and in Bolivia, in Ecuador and in Peru. You see a lot of state-owned companies, but also a lot of private enterprises in China. And human rights violations were related to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environmental in all 28 projects, indigenous people's rights, rights to an adequate standard of living, food, and housing, for example, by land grabbing, dispossession, and forced evictions, civil and political rights, very high levels of conflicts and violence. For instance, in Peru, typically, it has been all over the world, the information about that. Legal processes and lawsuits criminalizing human rights defenders and environmental defenders. Also, labor rights violations, poor working conditions. And just the last week, we got to know that there was a case in Brazil related to Chinese automobile electric vehicle company that you probably know, Build Your Dreams, who brought hundreds of Chinese workers on irregular visas to build a factory in Brazil, to build this kind of vehicles. And the government of Brazil stated that 163 of those workers hired by a contractor, a Chinese contractor, lived in almost slavery-like or worked in slavery-like conditions. So we still see these cases, even though I think China is trying to improve its standards. Firstly, it was very difficult to engage with representatives from Chinese companies because they used only to talk to the governments, and they didn't recognize the right of communities and civil society organizations to raise their voices or to protest. But it has been changing. SIGDA had, for instance, a meeting with the Chinese ambassador in Chile last year, talking about problematic projects, and that was very interesting. We also were consulted as SIGDA and as Latin America organizations about these compliance mechanisms from the Chamber of Mining, and we provided structured feedback on this mechanism. We hope that the pilot projects will work well, and we can learn from it, and we can use it in the future. We also produced a very interesting investigation about the presence of China in the frame of the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly the last 5 years in which the Belt and Road Initiative started in Latin America. And we have an executive summary in English available. And there are documented very interesting cases of participation of and financing of Chinese companies in the lithium and basically the lithium industry. We have other projects as well, but there are very interesting cases. So I would love to share this information with you. And I leave it here so you can ask and we can go deeper in these issues.
Excellent. Thank you, Maya. Really appreciate that. So we have about a little over half an hour to get some questions and comments from y'all. And we have one or two online that I'll incorporate, but let's hear from the audience first what kind of questions you want to throw at folks. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm Aaron with Earthworks and Ms. Ray. Chinese state-owned enterprises and then the private ones. I hear in the United States from domestic companies coming to complain that they want to mine, but the Chinese SOEs or the privates undercut them, undercut their prices. Like they want the cobalt, it's there, but then the Chinese SOEs undercut them. I guess I have two questions really. First is, there's this idea in the United States about putting on our own price supports or our own mineral reserve, which would be maybe not state-owned, but the state would give it over to a third party to manage a reserve and price support. So my point is, would the U.S. doing that help work? And I guess the second question is about the multi-development banks.
Yeah.
Because I was unaware that we don't really support middle-income countries where most of the minerals are. My question then is, if I've seen this where Congress has looked at changing the policy so that middle-income countries could receive Ex-Im Bank or World Bank support, and would that help with China's SOE problem undercutting us? Would a reserve of our own minerals and price supports help?
So just to repeat, thank you for the two-part question. Basically, it stems from the idea or the fact that Chinese state-owned enterprises or private companies are undercutting prices for acquiring minerals overseas in other countries. Two possible responses to that. The United States could provide price supports, which would give a boost to, say, U.S. companies who are in competition with Chinese companies. And the second is because the United States presently doesn't provide multilateral or assistance to middle-range countries through multilateral development banks, could it change its policy and provide that kind of support? And would that give American companies a leg up, or at least even the playing field in terms of competition for minerals? Okay, so that was a question. Let's just see if there are other questions before we, I know you want to answer that. Let's just see if there are other folks in the back. Yeah.
Thank you for all these presentations. I'm wondering, so kind of building on that question, but pointing in a different direction, because the way that the Biden administration has talked about some of the trying to sort of create captive American supplies of minerals has been, we will do this because it will allow us to raise standards within the supply chain, and China would never do that. At the same time, then those same officials have fairly frequently said, and one of the serious problems we're facing with competition against China is that we have to abide by these higher standards. So that particular message, I think, they don't care that much about the standards. They care about gaining a captive supply of minerals for American companies and competing geopolitically with China. So I guess I'm pessimistic about the idea that a separate American supply chain would solve the problem from the perspective of those of us who care about human rights and labor rights. And kind of connecting back to the first panel, where I thought that the comment was, we're looking for a good model, but there aren't any. I wonder if it's possible to have a good model when you're dealing with race to the bottom dynamics. And I want to kind of raise the possibility and see what you think. And this, I think, could connect with Becky with the ideas that you're talking about around the DFIs, but just open the question more broadly. Is there a way of, rather than creating separate supply chains that supposedly will, some of which will have higher standards, but then would come into competition with those with lower standards that would allow lower costs? So would, like, even if the United States under Biden or under Trump were serious about that, which they're not, even if they were serious, they would still face competitive pressures from the competing supply chain, which would be able to offer lower costs. So is there another path out of this that requires a single system for the entire global supply chain network that holds everyone, includes everyone. So it's inclusive, it doesn't feed these geopolitical conflicts, but for that same reason can create binding standards that stop the race to the bottom dynamics that infect these supply chains. But yeah, what are the possibilities? I know the prospects are not good. What are the possibilities that we could be building toward as we try to create a more favorable landscape for progressive?
Excellent question. Rather than repeat everything, because it's long, I'll just say the race to the bottom dynamic is a problem when you're talking about, for instance, competing for minerals overseas, and that's obviously one way of undercutting prices. But is there a way of creating a single supply chain globally that avoids this race to the bottom, and that we can actually apply some raise the ceiling or raise, or however you describe that, improve conditions, labor and social conditions in that single supply chain? Okay, those are two very good questions. They're mostly to you, Becky, though I think Thea and probably Maya would have responses to that. But Thea, I do want to go back to, you raised some really important questions in your first part, and I don't want to leave you hanging or us hanging. So I want to go back to one in particular, and that was, should we be supporting the expansion of mining in the United States in order to decrease sacrifice zones in the global South? You said you had some thoughts about that, and I want to hear those thoughts. Maya, you can answer, of course, either of those questions, but there was a repeat question from the first round, and that is on no-go zones. In other words, should there be some no-go zones where there should just be no extraction? And I'm sure that there's some talk about that in Latin America, I imagine. And I want to hear from you, has there been some success? I mean, we of course have heard about the Yasuni example in Ecuador, but are there other examples where we have some successful discussions of no-go zones, just no mining by anybody, United States, China, whomever, or the national government, the national mining corporation? So let's start there. Why don't you go first with those questions?
Let me be really clear about the multilateral finance, because that was at the end and I didn't really get to complete the thought. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify. MDBs do directly support mining in middle-income countries. MDBs do not, however, for the most part, extend policy support for environmental and labor ministry in capacity building, for example, complying with the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative reporting requirements. Those primarily go to the lowest income countries through concessional finance channels. Policy lending is typically done through concessional channels in this way because it doesn't pay off right away. It doesn't help your balance of payments. It's not a commercial activity. And so that is primarily done for the lowest income countries in the world, primarily African and Afghanistan, some, a little. The largest recipient is Burkina Faso. That's important, but the World Bank Evolution Roadmap envisions expanding concessional finance to middle-income countries. That will enable policy lending for countries that are the producers of transition minerals to be able to create the knowledge and the capacity necessary to set and enforce high-level social and environmental standards. Because as we've seen, working with banks is great, but it's not enough. One of the things I didn't get to share with you is that another round of in-depth studies that we've done with regional partners in Latin America has shown very clearly where banks have standards and national governments don't, things fall through the cracks. Where national governments have standards and banks don't, things fall through the cracks. You do need both sides of the table working hand in hand. And so when it comes to transition minerals, there just is no significant multilateral policy support for sustainability and inclusion in operations. And it is not that they don't have any problems with that. That's not the issue. It's that they don't have access to concessional finance, and that is changing. So I do want to be clear about that. There has been discussion about why is China cheaper? China's cheaper for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is access to concessional financing, is access to public financing domestically. Now, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation was developed in part to compete with that, and since 2020 has given about $200 million in direct financial support for mining operations overseas. The US Exim Bank is going to get into that game. There was an announcement just the other day that Exim is going to get into that game. And so if we want to increase financing with high-level standards, that's a good thing. That's a good thing for communities and mining countries if there's more money available with strings that come with high-level standards. And that's ultimately the normative guide to my research, is the SDGs for mining countries as well as other developing countries. So that's a good thing if there's more money available that comes with strings of high-level performance. That's verifiable and accountable, right? More accountable money is a good thing, whether it's Chinese or Western. However, Jake, you're talking about unified standards, and that's so important. I'm so glad you're talking about that. And I think that one of the big obstacles to that, why we have this bifurcation or fragmentation of supply chain thinking, is because there's no traceability in the mineral sector, right? There's no way to work with a smelter, a nickel processor, and say, can you tell me whether virgin rainforest was cut down? Can you tell me whether you kicked indigenous communities off of their land or deprived them of their water resources in order to extract this? That just, the traceability isn't there, which is step 0.1 in getting to accountability. Now, at the CBD COP in October, at the Biodiversity COP in Colombia, the national governments of Colombia and Brazil put forth a kind of joint proposal to develop a global traceability initiative for minerals to help curtail illegal mineral mining, but this would also be the first baby step necessary for standards enforcement beyond just one particular supply chain that might be, overseen by one bank or one buyer. And it's supposed to be put up for a binding vote in Brazil at this year's COP. So it's really exciting that two Amazon basin countries who both deal with the problems of unregulated illegal mining are both behind putting forth a multilateral effort on governance and traceability. That's huge, and it's very exciting to see Global South leadership on these issues when sometimes it feels like North Atlantic countries may be losing some of their commitment to these issues. It's really great to see Global South leadership, and I'm excited to see where that goes. But that's where I'm watching as like the 0.01 baby step towards what you're talking about, Jake, which is a great idea, but we got to start with one step at a time. You cross that river feeling one stone at a time, as they say in China.
Excellent. Thank you. Thea.
That was so great. I'm so glad you ended on that point, which was going to be my first point. So I don't need to make it now. But yeah, I wanted to bring in the proposal for COP30 to bring forward a global governance. And I think, and a lot of it is around traceability and transparency, but some of it, as you kind of brought in at the end, also has to do with coordinating environmental and social kind of minimum standard type stuff. So I think that'll be a really interesting space to watch, as they say. But on the race to the bottom piece, I'm just going to say a little bit on this, and then John, I'll try to answer your question. I think that there's different means to that end, and one has to do with kind of global pacts, right? And that's kind of where you left off. But I want to bring back in the idea of like producer coordination, right? Because I think that, so an OPEC-like mechanism, and I'm not at all romanticizing like OPEC in its current state, right? But the origins of OPEC are a lot more interesting, I think, and in terms of like some positive examples for other sectors. And there are different ways to kind of disrupt the race to the bottom dynamic, but a really important way is for those at the so-called bottom to be kind of unified, right? And have some leverage over supply chains and over corporations. And it's possible that you will see more efforts towards this, especially, as you said, in the kind of vacuum of North Atlantic leadership, that we might see Latin American leaders, especially the progressive ones, double down on, we're not going to just bring these things to global places where they're also going to probably get watered down, though it's an important first step, but we're also going to implement this as producers and come to an agreement on minimum standards, on what royalty rates we expect from companies, right? On what type of concessional financing we should have access to, right? So a kind of more bottom-up strategy in that respect. But I wanted to add one other thing to the race to the bottom, which is when we look at like what has been really transformative in Latin American mining governance, which is, I'm not trying to say in some amazing state, but there have been really big changes over the past few decades. Some of them are parchment changes, but they're not unimportant. And some of them now have regulatory and enforcement muscle behind them. And so this touches at what I'm about to say touches on a couple of points maybe, but Latin America, I would say, is like the world leader in rights recognition related to mining, extractive industries, land-based industries of multiple sorts. Those started, and when we kind of think through how did it get to that place? And again, I'm not trying to romanticize a lot of these things, lack capacity, there's regulatory capture, but the rights are there in ways that they're not in any other region of the world. All of that started with intense social struggle at the super local level, right? So if we go back to some of the things that were talked about in the first panel, like these local communities and how they're affected and whether they get organized or not, and that was during, to Becky's point, like this recent commodity boom in the early 2000s, right, with a lot of Chinese, but also Canadian and other companies involved, right? So communities got organized, and out of that, I won't tell the whole story here, we had national legal reforms, constitutional reforms, also law reforms, regulatory reforms, and now finally, out of all of that, we have actual jurisprudence, meaning we have courts upholding these rights and enforcing them, which has, not to step on Maya's toes for your question for her, John, but has resulted in some cases in no-go zones for mining, right? Or has resulted in certain companies not being able to make their investment anymore because it's been determined that it would violate the rights of nature, right? So you have actual legal precedent for restricting mining or limiting it or rechanneling it to places that would be less harmful. And I think there's just a lot to learn from that. And that kind of gives me, is it just a dovetail to the piece about mining in the US, which is to say that the US doesn't have great mining regulations, right? And so it doesn't recognize any of the rights I just mentioned, the rights of indigenous people to prior consent, not at all. I mean, not even to prior consultation in the way that's understood in international law. There are tribal rights and treaty rights, but they don't include these more recent understandings of consultation and consent. We don't have rights of nature. We don't recognize environmental rights in any full-throated way, rights to water. I could go down the list because these are all rights that are recognized by Latin American countries in an official capacity at least, right? And so the US regulatory deficits around mining, and I know that there's some super experts in the room, but some of you may not be aware of this, like our mining code dates to 1872. That's that code, the General Mining Act of 1872, regulates all hard rock mining on public land. Public land is where a lot of the mining happens in the western states where a lot of the mining happens, right? So this is our main mining legislation in the US, and it was a piece of legislation passed to enable genocide and dispossession. I mean, I don't need to, like, it's from 1872, we can sort of put the points together here, and it's unchanged, right? And there have been heroic efforts to reform it, notably led by Grijalva, but the reforms have not happened. So we have really egregious regulatory deficits around mining in the US. What we do have is really great enforcement capacity when we use it, right? And we also have things like the Clean Air and Water Act, right? I'm not saying that there's no general holistic mining governance. So when we ask, like, would it be a better outcome environmentally, socially, et cetera, to have an enormous mining boom in the United States? I think we just first have to look at the state of US mining regulation, which is pretty abysmal. And then I think just one or two other points to add to that, and then I'll pass it to Maya, is that, you know, when we look at the kind of total mining pie of like mining demand and mining supply, it's not at all the case yet, at least, that the U.S. increasing the amount of mining projects in Nevada, for example, or California or Arizona, right, of lithium, of copper, of these other transition minerals, that is not putting a dent in global South production yet, right? So, you know, just not to loosely borrow a metaphor, just like I was saying, there's a process of energy addition, right? We're not substituting. On the whole, there are specific cases, but on the whole, globally, we're not substituting renewables with, we're not substituting fossil fuels with renewables. We're kind of adding to a growing energy mix. Similarly with mining, like you can have more mining production everywhere and not replace imports because there's more demand everywhere, right? And so it's not a substitution, it's an addition, which would be all well and good if like that was paired with other changes that actually changed extraction in the global South, right? So if we had more mining in the US and that was all being routed to domestic supply chains, And there was also a redistribution of other things, notably finance and the manufacturing that it enables, to the global south so that they could keep their minerals there. And I'm not arguing for an autarkic world, but just a world in which there aren't certain places that just extract and other places that just manufacture, right? So we need to redistribute other things, right, for it to be the case that more mining in the US helps the global south. And then the last point, that's like the global justice way to look at it, but then the local justice way to look at it is like, who is affected by global north mining, right? And so we can look at the specific indigenous tribes and other people that we can call land dependent, even if they're not indigenous, in Southern Europe, for example, and elsewhere. We could, think about the Greenland. I mean, there's a lot of places to go with this question, right? But it's rarely the case that that when extraction expands in the global north, which happened with the fracking boom, there's other precedents for it, that the people affected are like the wealthy policymakers or financiers, right? The people affected actually don't look that different in sociological terms from the folks in the global south that are on the front lines, right? And they themselves see it that way in a sort of global solidarity way, right? So I think there's just like a lot of questions to be answered, but I'll end it to say that like the fact that certain places in the world are slated for extraction is wrong, and we do need to redraw the map of extraction, but that doesn't mean like an unregulated mining boom in the global north, or that should not mean that for progressives at least.
Excellent. Thank you both for those responses. Maya, I'm going to turn to you. I will throw in a comment from my colleague, Manuel Perez Rocha, who points out that El Salvador passed a law banning mining. John Cavanagh can talk a little bit more of that. Unfortunately, it was also reversed by the current leader of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele. And also want to add one question for you, Maya, from the chat. And that is, how have Latin American labor unions approached Chinese companies setting up shop in their countries? You gave the example of Chinese companies importing or bringing in Chinese workers in Brazil, who then lived in slave conditions. But how have Latin American unions addressed this question of Chinese companies setting up shop? So 2 questions for you: no-go zones and labor unions.
Okay, thank you. First, I will start saying that we have recognized a lot of rights, but we doesn't reinforce them. Yeah, it's just the opposite that in the United States. You don't recognize the rights, but you reinforce the law. And exactly the opposite. We have the Escazú agreement, but well, it's a new agreement. It's still not applied. So the second thing that I want to say is that, like Thea said, governments are now basically interested in expediting new investments, and therefore they are rolling back environmental and social standards, and there is going through law reforms, environmental law reforms, to allow projects to be made. So I think we are going backwards, yeah, in my perception. I also believe that this narrative of the national strategies, it's really, it's just a narrative. Yeah, in the case of Chile, lithium has always been a state-owned resource that's not concessible, so I don't see any nationalization, but the opposite is that the government now is opening a bidding to mine lithium in salt flats in protected lands. That is new, yeah. So again, we are seeing that governments are trying to benefit from this new rush of transition minerals, and they want to take advantage of it. But finally, what we see is a bigger competition. We are like a milk cow in Latin America, and everyone wants the milk. Yeah, and so we are, as energy and mineral needs increase, yeah, it's addition, like Thea said. So we are becoming more and more not only sacrifice zones, but sacrifice countries in which really communities and the environment and citizens don't see any benefit of it. So we are also not so enthusiastic either about the financing of MDBs. We have followed the last years or 2 years, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, even European development banks like the German and the European, and the CAF, they are now focusing again in this competition. They are focusing again in financing projects in the sector, the mining sector in Latin America. But there are new formulas of financing. They are giving financing to the governments, and the government use that facility, that financial facility, to finance private projects. But communities are not allowed to use the independent accountability mechanisms of the bank to file their complaints, because the money goes to the government. So the government is liable for any problem, but not the bank. And again, we see that the standards are not applied or are not followed. So we are not seeing the evolution of these transition minerals demand as a benefit for our region, really. We have not seen the benefit for the people, for the environment, and we are in great concern about what is going to happen now that everyone wants to be here in our countries and to take a little bit or a bigger piece of the pie. Yeah, that's my perspective and the perspective from the organizations I work with.
Thank you, Maya. That the well, thank you, Maya. The image of Latin America as a milk cow that we all want milk from is deeply disturbing to me, especially since I'm lactose intolerant. We have about 10 minutes left, and this will be our final round. I'm going to throw in 2 more questions, so you can answer all of those. But be mindful that you are between us and wine that comes out when this is over. So the longer you talk, the less wine we get. But I want you to answer all these questions fully. So this is a challenge. Okay, so 2 last questions in addition to everything else that's on the table. Corruption, the question of corruption. When we talk about a cartel, a producer cartel, how can we ensure that these are not going to be entirely corrupt actors that will have, even more malign impact? And the second question is free trade agreements. Europe, for instance, has been scrambling to sign FTAs with Latin American countries to ensure its access to these minerals, as the United States considers its FTAs. So are there access points? Are there, would you call them pinch points? No, pinch points. Are there pinch points on this FTA question where we can have some impact and actually ensure better trade agreements with higher standards for labor and environment? Okay, corruption, FTAs, and any outstanding other questions you want to answer in the next 10 minutes divided by 3. That's 3 minutes and something per person. Thank you.
I guess I'll start with corruption. It's important to recognize that this is a region where I think 2 years ago, Peru built a prison for former presidents. Literally. I mean, it's a very small president, but that is business as usual, unfortunately. The evasion of national standards in order to be able to reap private benefits from public money is unfortunately endemic in any sector involving a large amount of money with institutions that are often very young, underfunded, etc. We fortunately have not seen that level of corruption with Chinese engagement in the region over the past 20 years, right? So the presidents who got brought down recently in Peru primarily did so because of backroom dealings with Brazil for using their contractors, taking their public money public loans to use their contractor of Odebrecht. So similar arrangement, but before any of the transparency laws were put on the books, often before the Environment Ministry was established in 2008. A lot of the legal reforms happened in the wake of that, trying to avoid repeating that. And so far, we have not seen a lavajato, that was the name of that scandal, we have not seen a lavajato with Chinese characteristics yet. That is anything of that scale in the region. Knock on wood, this hopefully means that some of these rights that have been established, which of course have imperfect applications, but which do include more transparency than they did before, is really the best guard against that. And this goes back to the continued interplay of who's at the table, the government, as well as the outside lender, as well as the local folks who get to make money off of the deal. So yes, this continues to be an issue, but fortunately, we have not seen the same level of scandal that we saw prior to the China boom, which doesn't mean it isn't happening and we just don't see it yet, but we haven't seen it yet. So hopefully this means that some of these reforms are working. Regarding FTAs, just want to, for a moment, point out the harm that CBAM might do to the global south, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is working on. So while China is signing FTAs, Europe may be complicating trade with them, the US may be complicating trade with them. And so we may see more South-South trade to compensate. This is essentially what happened when the US put tariffs on Chinese goods and China compensatory tariffs on US goods. China simply started buying agricultural goods from South America. So we may see more South-South trade if both the US and Europe are putting up trade barriers, which of course is the opposite of what that question was about. But while FTAs are being signed, we also have trade barriers going up in the form of CBAM, which won't have a huge effect on Latin America because hydropower is a huge part of the power matrix. So there isn't a huge carbon input from the power grid, but we will likely see an impact in Africa. I'll leave it there.
I had some thoughts on the corruption question, but I'm actually going to save them because you had an interesting answer there that I think addressed a lot of it. I kind of want to go to Trump for a moment, which I feel like was part of this prompt, but we didn't fully get there. And I want to go to the Greenland thing that I kind of put there intentionally as something to hopefully pick back up later. And I have no idea if Trump is going to carry through on any of his threats, but I think it's interesting to observe that something like territorial acquisition in the name of resource access is like back on the table, right? In terms of something that maybe we thought was left behind in a prior era of imperialism. And also something that I think seems like in a really superficial way to be the opposite of what the first Trump government was trying to do and Biden did much more of, which is like onshore mining, right? So like we have these different contending models of like how great powers or imperial powers, if we want to use that term, are going to acquire their resources, right? And it, you know, on the one hand, we have this idea of like, we need to throw sweeteners at companies so that they set up mining in the US. That's what the IRA did. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act also has some of that, right? The idea is let's encourage mining in the US to have supply chain security, right? And Trump really started, I mean, not that it was Trump's idea, it dates to earlier in the 20th century, but Trump brought that back with his executive orders around critical minerals, with trying to expedite US mining. Biden doubled down, and Dems in Congress and bipartisan efforts in Congress doubled down on that. And now Trump is back in office, and he's been, or about to be back in office, and he's been saying, I want more mining in the US, but he's also saying, I'm gonna try to like take over Greenland and also the Panama Canal. And I think it's interesting to see how these logics are not that distinct, right? How like one way to onshore is to have more mining or whatever the process in question is in your country. Another way is to expand your country, to include, right, expand the shore, right? And so, and I'm not saying this is about to happen, but that it's on the table is important and concerning. So when we think about the perspective of Latin America and the milk cow, right? And like, are there live possibilities of like US using slightly harder forms of diplomacy to corral Latin American countries into kind of being resource providers for the US, like more than they already are? Like, I just think there's kind of a way in which this is already ratcheting up. Some of the possibilities are expanding. But there is, in my view, and not to overstate bipartisan consensus, but a pretty coherent logic of like the US deserves resources. We merit them just because of being a great power. And there's a lot of different tools that we're going to use to get them, whether it's expanding domestic mining or just like forms of external diplomacy or even forms of external intervention. So I'll just, I guess, leave the final pre-wine comment.
Excellent, thank you. Maya, you get the last word, and I apologize, we don't have wine for you, but you get to, there is a lot in Chile, that's a good point.
Right. Well, you asked about what can we do? And I think the first thing is to strengthen civil society in our countries, their capacities, resources, etc., to really be able to monitor these investments, operations, etc. Yeah, and to force governments and also the companies to heighten their standards. Yeah, Chile is in this moment adhering to a global standard of transparency in the extractive industry, and civil society is pushing hard to implement an ambitious plan, not just checklisting, we have done it, but really to have a meaningful implementation of that process. So I think civil society is very important as a counterpart and balance for all this. It's very difficult. We are the weakest part of the, and regretfully, I have not seen labor unions standing against human rights violations of Chinese activities and business in Latin America. So I have not seen much of that, but there are lots of environmental and organizations or human rights defender organizations that are working together and trying to monitor and trying also to recommend better practices and to get in touch with Chinese actors to help them understand our environment, our concerns, our interests and expectations. So that's from my side what I would recommend.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you very much. Before I ask you to applaud everybody, I want to add a couple of people for you to applaud, and that would be our translators that you, of course, haven't been taking advantage of, but the people online have been very dependent on our wonderful translators, so I want to thank them. And I want to thank NETFA for the technical support here. Everything has gone so smoothly, you haven't even noticed that there's technical support. And of course, Justices Global, my colleagues, Sandy and Valentina, thank you so much, and my colleagues at IPS. Okay, now we can applaud our wonderful panel.
Pleasure.
As promised, we will have wine and some non-alcoholic beverages, and thank you all for coming and participating.
Enjoy. Good afternoon.